Guys, at the time of recording, it's Tuesday evening. Terry Flanagan fought on Saturday against Petr Petrov, and I've only just been able to catch the fight due to other commitments going on in my life at present. Prior to watching the fight, I caught a bit of the Boxing Voice, which is a podcast that I listen to on and off, and I actually heard a few of the guys on the Boxing Voice sort of suggesting that perhaps Petr Petrov had actually won the fight, and this was a robbery in favour of Terry Flanagan. So I was pretty keen to check the fight out. Obviously Flanagan won by a unanimous decision, and was keen to give you a few thoughts on it. First and foremost, I definitely think Terry Flanagan deserved to win the fight. On my card, I'm probably giving, I didn't score it, you know, I didn't score it precisely, but on my card, I think off the top of my head, I'd probably give Petr Petrov 4 or 5 rounds. I scored the first 6, and then the second 6 I kind of found a bit harder to score because I was multitasking. But after 6, I had Flanagan 4-2 up, although I could have maybe made a case to have it 3-3 even. I thought Petrov had a good shout of winning rounds 2, 3 and 5. But I didn't think this was the best performance from Terry Flanagan, despite the fact that I do believe that he won the fight. I thought Flanagan perhaps failed to impress in what was his biggest test to date against the best opponent of his career to date. And unfortunately, the question will now arise, you know, whether the reason he failed to impress was because this is what happens when you step Terry Flanagan up against a guy who is, you know, on the borderline of top 10 in his division, because I don't believe he's faced someone at that sort of level before. I thought Flanagan had a huge advantage over Petr Petrov when he was boxing from the outside. Flanagan's jab, when he used it, was effective. Flanagan's combinations from the outside were decent. You know, he was landing nice straight punches on Petrov. He was showing good hand speed. And I thought Flanagan's footwork was very, very decent. For me, what was frustrating from Flanagan was the fact that he didn't truly commit to that jab and utilise it throughout large portions of the fight. It's particularly frustrating when you've got an outside boxer who's got a good jab and who's using that jab effectively, but they just don't commit to it enough. And for me, whenever Flanagan was using that jab, it was a very, very effective method, especially in a fight like this where you've got Flanagan as the bigger guy with the advantage from the outside and Petrov as the presser fighter looking to close down the gap. I really think in a fight that goes that way stylistically, the use of the jab from the bigger man, the use of the jab from the guy with the advantage from the outside is absolutely key. And I was surprised to see Flanagan go for large portions of this fight without really committing to the jab. I think if he'd have done that, it may have dissuaded Petrov, who came forward pretty constantly. And some of those close rounds, because, you know, even though I scored this fight to Flanagan with a little bit in hand, some of those close rounds were very, very competitive. And I think if Flanagan had really committed to that jab, the visual impression that one would be left with was that he won the fight a lot more comfortably. So I thought that was disappointing from Flanagan. But on the whole, I thought he was the better outside worker, and I thought his footwork was very good. You know, Petrov was really, really relentlessly coming forward. Petrov seemed to be looking to position Flanagan up against the ropes or in a corner, and Flanagan did a very good job of, you know, wheeling out of trouble, pivoting, keeping the centre of the ring, keeping distance with his feet. If he'd combined that with a consistent jab, I think he'd have negated, you know, the majority of the effects that Petr Petrov was having. I thought Petrov had a few spells in the fight where he really mounted the pressure on Flanagan, and there were 1 or 2 particularly memorable occasions when he got Flanagan up against the ropes and looked to unload. But those were few and far between, and really Flanagan actually dealt with those quite nicely with his footwork. So I give him a lot of credit for that. As for Petrov, I actually think that I made a fair point in my pre-fight prediction video. So what I said in that video is that, having looked at footage of Petrov, I kind of felt he was a guy who got into range by throwing a wild haymaker, or got into range by throwing a really loose, sweeping power punch and then simply walking in after that. And I said in my pre-fight video, I thought he'd be particularly vulnerable to being caught on the way in. And I do think that was the case for large spells of the fight. I thought that whilst Petrov was having some success, he couldn't really bridge that gap and finalise that transition from the outside to the inside. And he spent too long of this fight fighting Terry Flanagan's game on the outside. I thought Flanagan just about did enough to keep him on the outside, and Flanagan was catching him with straight punches as Petrov was coming in. If Petrov had maybe had a bit different footwork, if he'd been slightly faster on his feet, if he'd maybe tried to set up that transition from the outside to the inside with a jab, potentially he could have had more effect. But he didn't. He kind of often looked to throw a wild punch to get the opponent to sell up and then kind of walk into range, and Flanagan was wise to that. One thing Flanagan was not wise to in this fight was the straight right hand for Petrov. And I know Flanagan's a southpaw, and a straight right hand is widely known in boxing as the antidote to deal with southpaws. But boy, Petrov had success with that right hand. Flanagan's very, very lucky, to be honest, that Petrov wasn't hurting him with that right hand, and that Petrov wasn't a big puncher, because for me, Petrov was landing that punch consistently through the fight, and it was actually a bit of a worry that Terry Flanagan did very, very little to adapt to that. He was getting caught with that punch round after round after round, and I saw very little in the way of adaptation from Terry Flanagan in sort of recognising that Petrov was regularly leading with that right hand and doing something to defend against it. He was eating that punch a lot, and that's something that he's certainly got to look out for. All in all, Flanagan was the classier guy. He was the classier boxer from the outside. He was the bigger guy. He was, he had the better straight punches, the better jab. I just feel that it was a slightly imperfect performance, because the fact that he didn't commit to the jab, the fact that he was eating that right hand from Petrov a lot, really made this fight a lot closer than it needed to be. And I put up a status on my Facebook earlier to get some feedback from people, and the general consensus did seem to be that this was a close competitive fight, which Flanagan did deserve to win, but that Petrov stole 4 or 5 rounds away. And I guess the concern is, Petrov is a solid borderline top 10 operator, but Petrov does a lot fairly badly. He's not a big puncher. He's a small guy at the weight. He really does lunge in wildly when he's looking to close. He's not very technically refined in terms of the way he's trying to walk down opponents and close down that gap. And he was also quite poorly balanced, I thought. Several times you see him swinging wildly and almost knock himself off his feet. Yet Petrov took 4 or 5 rounds off him. And it is a bit of a concern for me. This is the biggest test of Flanagan's career today. This was the best opponent he's been in with. But this was an opponent who really I'd have had Flanagan beaten with a little bit in hand. And I guess, to be fair, he did do that. But I think the fight showed several holes in Flanagan's game, which has made me believe he could potentially be vulnerable to a more elite presser fighter. The way Petrov was having success, if he was up against an opponent who maybe, threw a double jab to Flanagan's chest, a little bit of head movement, getting low, stepping in, potentially Terry Flanagan would be very, very vulnerable against that. And I do think the fact that he is potentially intending in future to go up to 140 pounds, I do think that move may not work out so well for him, because Flanagan typically enjoys a size advantage in his fight, and if he loses that size advantage and comes up against presser fighters who are able to take the success that Petrov enjoyed and bring it to the new level, because they're bigger guys and because they're more technically refined, I do think Flanagan could be in trouble. I also think that the fact he was consistently eating that right hand lead specifically, I think people will take note of that and look to use that against him in future. Flanagan's, he's still young, he's 27, he's got good footwork, he's got a very good jab. He just needs, as I say, commit to it, double it up, change levels with it, which he's not doing. And, all in all, as I say, fight was closer than it needs to be. I have to give a word to the scoring, because, on my channel we've given Eddie Hearn and Matchroom a hell of a lot of criticism when it comes to scoring. I think some of the Frank Warren fans out there, believe that my channel is very much in favour of Eddie Hearn, which it really isn't the case. But what I will say is, on my channel we've been very critical in the past of some of the scorecards on the Eddie Hearn shows. Ricky Burns, Kirill Relic, Anthony Crolla versus Linares 1. More recently, Gavin McDonnell versus Ray Vargas. We've really teared into that scoring, especially on the podcast. And I've got to say, the scoring here was almost as bad. It really was almost as bad. And I think if we've been very, very critical of those Eddie Hearn scorecards, likewise we've got to be critical of some of these scorecards. One of the judges quite spectacularly had this fight in Terry Flanagan's favour, 120 to 108. In other words, that judge watched all 12 rounds of this fight and could not find one round to give to Petr Petrov. He thought Terry Flanagan won every single round, which I think is ludicrous. One of the other judges had it 118 to 110, which I still think is a bizarrely generous scorecard. I think that 116, 112, 115, 113. I think those are probably 116, 112 would be my scorecard. But I think 116, 112, 115, 113, I personally wouldn't argue with those scorecards. I thought Petrov had real success for periods of the fight and definitely did enough to take multiple rounds off Terry Flanagan. And I think 120, 108 is an embarrassment, and I think it's a disgrace, actually, in the strongest possible terms. You know, if you look at these three judges' scorecards, how bizarre is it that if Terry Flanagan had given up 3 further rounds, you know, if Terry Flanagan had lost 3 further rounds and Petrov was given those 3 further rounds, Flanagan would have still won this fight. You know, on those judges' scorecards, one of them gave it to Flanagan by 12, one of them gave it to Flanagan by 8, and one of them gave it to Flanagan by 4. So, you know, had those 3 rounds swung the other way, had you taken 3 points off Flanagan and given those 3 points in favour of Petr Petrov, the 120, 108 would have been 117, 111. The 118, 110 would have been 115, 113 in favour of Flanagan. And it's crazy to think that Flanagan could have given up 3 rounds in this fight, in addition to the ones that that the judges scored against him already, and he'd have still won this fight. So, pretty disgraceful scoring that is, and I think that needs to be highlighted, and I think that needs to be, criticised, and we'll discuss that again in the podcast, and see what people's thoughts are, because I'd like to hear more fuss about how bad that scoring is, just in the sense of being even-handed. As for Terry Flanagan, where does he go from here? That's a difficult question, that is. The water's deep at 135, it is. Jorge Linares, Mikey Garcia, I'm picking those guys to beat Terry Flanagan right now. I'm probably picking Robert Easter Jr. to beat Terry Flanagan right now. Flanagan's got a very weak resume, considering how long he's been unbeaten in the sport. And I've said it before in this video, but in my opinion, this is the first time he's actually stepped into top 10 level. And he stepped into top 10 level, he's lost multiple rounds, he's failed to establish his jab, he's eaten a lot of punches. And whilst he's proved to be the superior operator, he kind of hasn't given the impression that there's that much of a gap in class between Terry Flanagan and Petr Petrov, and I was kind of under the assumption that the gap in class between the two would have been a lot wider than actually was the case. So, for me, I've got slight concerns over Terry Flanagan at 135. I think the glamorous fights out there for him in the division are fights that, unfortunately, he would lose at this stage. Up at £140, I'm unconvinced. I actually think £140 is potentially a weaker division than 135. Obviously, Terence Crawford is reigning supreme at the top of the division, and he's the elite fighter. But apart from him, I think at 140, the water isn't quite as deep in terms of the other names as it is at 135. So that'll be interesting. To see how he, if he does move up there, how he transitions. I suspect he'll stay at 135 for now. I think that wasn't a perfect performance, and given the fact that he potentially eats a few punches, and given the fact that he doesn't carry much power even at 135, I'm not sure 140 would be a match made in heaven, especially because he's enjoyed a size advantage in most of his fights, and he'd clearly be losing that, stepping up to 140 £140. So that would be a concern for me from a Terry Flanagan perspective. And I guess another concern for me would be the talks of a Lomachenko fight at 135. Frank Warren's come out on Twitter and he said that he's actively going to, see if he can make that fight and get Lomachenko over to the UK. Now, of course, I'm sceptical. Lomachenko's a big name in boxing, and is he going to want to come over to the UK to fight Terry Flanagan, especially after he's just seen scorecards like that? Flanagan is also, as I've mentioned, a big guy at 135, and Lomachenko's the weight class below. So there's reasons to believe Lomachenko may not fancy that fight. Potentially there's far bigger options out there to him, more glamorous options, bigger money options, bigger name options, and maybe Terry Flanagan isn't the most attractive of propositions. Having said that, I also don't think that fight is completely beyond the realms of possibility, because if you look at the 130-pound division where Lomachenko's operating, you wonder, where are the big glamour fights for him there? Gervonta Davis is an obvious big-name fight for him, but I think Davis has made clear that he's not looking for that Lomachenko fight anytime soon. And, if Lomachenko is looking to step up to 135 and fight names like Mikey Garcia, he may actually view Terry Flanagan as a stepping stone, a chance to get experience at 135 and a chance to win a belt at 135 so that he can step up to fight Mikey Garcia in a unification fight. So I don't think that fight is completely impossible, and I guess that would be an interesting fight, but you'd have to make Terry Flanagan a huge underdog against Lomachenko, because even though Flanagan's a bigger guy than Lomachenko, he's not a guy who you'd think is necessarily going to be able to brutalise Lomachenko with his power, and he's not someone who uses his size to great effect. He's not someone who massively roughs up the smaller man. He's not someone who's going to be able to keep Lomachenko at distance with a long-rangey jab that he commits to. Well, certainly not based on his Petr Petrov fight. So, unfortunately, I think the difficulty for Flanagan is all of these glamour name fights. Lomachenko, Linares, Garcia. I think he loses all of those big name fights. And I still think the problem is that he's not a big enough name, a big enough ticket seller, a big enough celebrity that people are really going to be interested in seeing him fight, borderline competition. The Crolla fight seems to have gone, for now at least. So it's hard to see necessarily what his next moves will be, but I'll await with great interest to see, what Frank Warren does do with him, I guess. There's my thoughts on that fight in total, really. I think the scoring was a disgrace. I thought Flanagan's footwork was good. I thought his outside work was good. I thought Petrov had success but was very limited, specifically in his balance, the way he came lunging in, etc. And I think Flanagan, for me, is someone who I've never been fully convinced about. A lot of people I really respect in boxing, people like Ultratech Sports, people like off my podcast, etc., really have viewed this guy as a real talent for a long time. And I'm just not so sure. I think there's holes in his game. I think he's got a very weak resume. And I think as he continues to step up in level beyond the Petr Petrovs of this world, there's reason to suspect that he may well get found out. That's just my perspective. Just a quick word for Jack Catterall. Jack Catterall on the undercard. I've also done separate videos on Liam Smith, Liam Williams, Daniel Dubois, which were uploaded to the channel yesterday. But I watched Jack Catterall and Martin Gethin today. Now, Catterall is someone I've never been high on. He's never been someone who's really caught my imagination. But I must say, he looked very tidy against Martin Gethin. I was at the Martin Gethin John Wayne Hibbard fight ringside, and I thought that was such an entertaining scrap and a good fight. I wanted to see Gethin out again. And Gethin, for me, I don't know what he was doing in that fight. His lack of head movement was startling, and he was just almost like a stationary target, allowing Catterall to unload on him. So, this fight, Gethin was so poor, you almost have to question just how much credit you give Catterall. Having said that, I am going to give Catterall credit, because I thought he put his punches together very nicely. I thought he looked very tidy in there. His combination punching was on point, his accuracy was on point, and he stopped Martin Gethin inside 3 rounds, working the head, dropping him to the body, really making it unpleasant for him in there. So I'm going to give Jack Catterall some credit. Understand that they may potentially look to make an in-house fight between Catterall and Tyrone Nurse. I think that's a good fight for both guys. It's a more high-profile fight for both guys, and it's a fight which, I know it's still early in both guys' career, but in many ways, they're both guys who probably have aspirations of going higher than British level. Understand Catterall is already number 2 in the WBO potentially for the light welterweight championship. Unsure how keen he's going to be to go down that route with Crawford as the number 1 fighter, but you never know. But that's potentially an interesting fight. And live division domestically there, Tyrone Nurse, O'Hara Davies, Josh Taylor, and potentially Jack Catterall can get involved in that mix. So it's an exciting division domestically. Obviously, if Terry Flanagan steps up to 140, you've got Ricky Burns there at 140 fighting Julius Ndongo in a unification. We could have some real decent domestic clashes in Britain in that division. Some talk of Anthony Crolla even campaigning in that division, and I do believe at some point Luke Campbell will go out that way, because I think Luke Campbell is a monstrous lightweight. But yeah, those are my thoughts, guys. Do drop your comments on this video. I'm always keen to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you thought about Flanagan, versus Petrov. Am I being harsh on Terry, or were those holes that I've identified in this game, you know, really, really visible in this fight? What did you make of the performance? What do you make of the most likely next moves for Terry Flanagan? What do you think Frank will set up for him? Do you think Flanagan should leave and go to Eddie Hearn? Drop me your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, drop me your thoughts on Jack Catterall. Who do you like to see him fight next? And, you know, where you sort of rate him in that light welterweight mix domestically. If you enjoyed the video, please do take the time to hit the thumbs up button. I'd appreciate that massively. If you're new to the channel or you haven't done so before for whatever reason, please do take the time to hit the thumbs up button and press subscribe so you can check out all of my other videos. As always, many thanks for tuning in, guys.